So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the Boundary Dam Unit 3 project, but before I do, I just want to touch on a couple things that I've seen just in the last day and a bit that I've been here. The first one is progress. There's a lot of progress here, and it was really fascinating to listen to the panel, hear updates, and there aren't many projects out there that are getting close to a final investment decision as soon as the second quarter of 2024. So it's a real credit to North Dakota and the progressive nature of the projects that are being studied here. So congratulations to you folks on that. And in addition to have the approval to actually have the storage space available, in addition to having the primacy rights for wells, you guys are quite a ways ahead of other states and ahead of Canada as well in many ways, I would say. So congratulations on that. And the other piece is the education piece. And I can't agree enough with all the conversation with education that's been happening today. It's vitally important, and listening to the wind and solar conversations earlier today, it's really great to hear people that understand it, explaining it in a way that can be understood. And I think we really do need to get that out of rooms like this and into the public sphere. And I had the opportunity when my kids were in grade 6, it's in the curriculum in Canada, to talk about energy production, electricity production. I went to the schools and talked to the kids, and it was fascinating to see how little they knew about it and how quickly they grasped it, how quickly they understood the difference between intermittent power and dispatchable power, where you could hit the gas pedal and ramp up and down to match the load as it changes throughout the day. It's not a complicated topic, and we can get that topic out there. I think we just need to get started and get it out in the public. The other interesting thing on the education front is at the Knowledge Center, we had a small contract for the Environment and Climate Control Canada organization, essentially the equivalent to the EPA here. We wrote a little paper for them talking about carbon capture, what it meant, and how it compares to other technologies, and we presented that paper to their team of engineers. So these are a bunch of educated people. They basically, they do understand it, but the bias was fascinating. The bias in that room of the engineers that we were explaining the outcome of our paper to, they were very swayed, very much in favor of the renewable resources, and not necessarily understanding how you need to have a balance and the all of the above approach that Barry talked about first thing this morning. And it was fascinating to me to see Isaac's analysis of what happens if you were to follow the EPA's assumptions and what happens to the system. It's really important to get that information out there. So I just wanted to share that before I jump into my presentation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Boundary Dam Unit 3. It's been in service for about 9 years. I'll talk a little bit about the CCS Knowledge Center, some of the things that we've learned, and some of the things that we share with people. So it's kind of a nerdy engineering type topic, and I'll try to keep it interesting. So the CCS Knowledge Center, Boundary Dam Unit 3, Practical Carbon Capture Lessons Learned. So I've changed the title a little bit from what's in the program. But really, this is the core of what the CCS Knowledge Center does, is we talk to people about what SaskPower learned going through this project. And I want to thank Mike Holmes and Jason for inviting me to come out here and talk. And back in June, they actually brought my team down here. We did a day-and-a-half technical workshop, walked through 450 slides of very deep technical learnings from that project. I don't think anybody fell asleep. I'm not going to go through 450 slides today. But it was a lot of fun to come down and meet with all the folks down here that are burning coal still. So the CCS Knowledge Center, we're not that well known. We're a very small nonprofit organization that SaskPower stood up shortly after starting the BD3 project with the carbon capture facility on it. So that unit went into service in October of 2014. So it's coming up on 9 years of operation. The CCS Knowledge Center was started up in 2016 with the sole goal of promoting the widespread adoption of large-scale CCS, building on the path that SaskPower blazed by doing the world's first project. For the first 5 years or so, there was a lot of conversation, a lot of going to conferences, a lot of sharing information, and not a lot of action. And just in the last 2 or 3 years, there's a lot more action. A lot more people are really looking at CCS, and it's been a lot of fun to share what we learned with other people across all industries, not just the power sector. So CCS, we see it as quite critical to the electricity sector in both of our countries and really all around the world. I couldn't agree more with Barry's conversation about all of the above. That's the same thing that I stress. there's nothing wrong with solar power, there's nothing wrong with wind power. Nuclear power is a fantastic source of electricity, so is coal-fired power. And I think we need to make sure we have a diverse electricity grid is a strong electricity grid. And I'm a little bit concerned about my home province. We're heading down the natural gas path, and there's going to be a lot of natural gas generation and not much else in the short term. So some of the things that are driving CCS, and I don't need to reiterate with you guys, this with you folks, but you've got the EPA rule asking you to reduce the emissions from fossil-fired plants, be it natural gas or coal. Up in Canada, our government has dictated that we'll have a net zero electricity system by 2035. It's okay for some provinces. The power system in Canada is very much set by the resources that are available. So we have some provinces that are 100% hydropower fired fueled, so they have no problem getting the net zero by 2035. They're already there today. It's very challenging for my province of Saskatchewan and our neighboring province of Alberta, which are very much dependent on fossil fuel resources, for our economy and obviously for our electricity generation as well. And prior to this clean electricity regulation that's actually just undergoing a consultation period right now, the Canadian federal government put forward a rule that you can't have any unabated coal-fired power past 2030. So the writing's already on the wall here for coal-fired power in Canada, and unfortunately the majority of the Alberta coal-fired power plants have already been converted to natural gas, and Saskatchewan is likely to follow suit because 2030 is coming very fast. And as you likely know, it's a pretty long timeline to develop a carbon capture project, so there really isn't time for them to do a lot with the existing coal-fired plants to abate them or add carbon capture. So a little bit, just the life cycle of a carbon capture project, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we think optimistically there's about a 6-year time frame to do a carbon capture project, from understanding it, kind of just really knowing what it is, getting into a feasibility study that probably takes about a year, a feed study, a couple years to get to the level of certainty. Craig talked about having essentially a executable project at the end of his feed study, so getting really deep into the weeds and understanding the economics, understanding the full business case. That's a big project. That takes a long time, and we think that's a couple years optimistically. And then 3 years to build the project, and then you're into startup and commissioning and ongoing operation. So that 6-year timeline is pretty long, and we think that's actually optimistic. So that doesn't include any sort of regulatory delays, any challenges with permits, any of those sorts of things. So most people that we work with, again, across a bunch of different industries, they're really in that purple zone, that feasibility, feed study zone, the same place that you folks are here in North Dakota. We're cautiously optimistic that a few people will go from the purple zone into the red zone, and from what I'm hearing from the conference today and a little bit yesterday, is that could happen here potentially first, which is exciting. So we just list out a few of the things that our team can help with, again, building on the learnings from Boundary Dam Unit 3 through those different zones of a project. So Boundary Dam Unit 3, this is an overall picture of the Boundary Dam facility. You can see the power plant on the left-hand side there, kind of in the middle. Off the right-hand side is the capture plant and the compression building, and then kind of behind the coal pile in the upper right-hand corner of the picture, that's the heat rejection system. So that it does take up a lot of space. I know a few people have been up to see it. It's larger than you would think. It's really interesting to come up and see it in person, see how much footprint it takes, how much equipment it takes to finally, at the end of all this equipment, you've got one little pipeline that goes under the ground and sends CO2 away. So again, this facility's been in service for almost 9 years. It's captured over 5.5 million. It was 5.6 million last time I was down there. And it's been operating since the fall of 2014. So the design capacity for Boundary Dam was 1 million tons per year capture. So you can do some quick math, 9 years of operation, 1 million tons a year, should probably be at 9 million tons, theoretically. And there have been a number of challenges that we, again, talk to people about and help them not to replicate some of the things that if SaskPower had a time machine and it could go back, they would do some things differently. And I'll talk about a few of those here today. So a little bit more about the project. Total capital expenditure of the project was $1.5 billion Canadian. About 900 million of that was for the capture facility. About 600 million was for the power plant itself. It was aided by a federal grant, so they got about $250 million in funding from the federal government of Canada. And the interesting thing is at the time that it was approved back in 2011, the price of natural gas was about $8 a gigajoule. And it was actually competitive with unabated natural gas options that SaskPower had on the table. That's why they went forward with it. It was supported by some revenue from enhanced oil recovery, those sorts of things, but it was actually the economic choice for SaskPower at the time. So what do they do with the CO2 they capture at SaskPower? So I mentioned a little bit already, they get some revenue from enhanced oil recovery. So they send the CO2 to the same oil field that the Dakota gasification CO2 has been going to since the early 2000s, the Weyburn-Midale oil field. So that field is stored, the numbers that they give us is 38 million tons, but that's a little bit old. It's probably about 40 million tons that field is safely stored since 2000. So it's a very successful example of enhanced oil recovery, not only generating more oil production, but safely storing CO2. In addition to sending it to the enhanced oil recovery field in Weyburn-Midale, there's an aquastore well that actually it's quite deep. It's about a 2-mile deep well, and it safely stores CO2 in a sandstone formation, a depleted saline aquifer formation. That well is kind of a research well that's heavily monitored. There are a lot of instrumentation on the well. A lot of people have come from around the world and studied that well, and it's a good example of what happens to the CO2 plume when it's in the subsurface as it expands through the pores in the rock. Where does it go? What does it do? And proving that it stays down there, and it's reacting essentially as they had predicted. So it's a really good example for the public outreach sort of conversations of, hey, we've been doing this for 20 years plus in Canada, and it's been proven to be safe. This is a diagram, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the diagram, but this is the overall picture of the Boundary Dam Unit 3 carbon capture process. Starting on the left-hand side, we burn coal, we produce steam, which we use to produce electricity. And then the flue gas comes out the back end. And what they have there is a dry electrostatic precipitator, and that's the only air quality cleanup equipment that was in place at Boundary Dam before this project started. So one advantage of that is the flue gas is quite hot. And what Boundary Dam was able to do is take that hot flue gas that has to be cooled from about 350 degrees Fahrenheit down to 160, 180 degrees Fahrenheit. They take that energy and put it back into the Rankine cycle in the power production process, and they actually gain about 4 megawatts of generation by doing that. So it's quite a good example of thermal integration and minimizing the energy required to regenerate the amine and do the carbon capture process. What that means, the fact that they only had a dry ESP, is they had to do something about sulfur. Sulfur has to be removed from the flue gas before the CO2 can be extracted. So there are actually 2 amine cycles at this plant, which won't be indicative, I don't think, of most plants. There's already some sort of sulfur control likely in place. But SaskPower has an amine system for sulfur, followed by an amine system for CO2. The one upside to the amine system for sulfur is it actually produces sulfur in a form that it can be converted into sulfuric acid, and SaskPower gets a little bit of revenue from selling some sulfuric acid on the side. So after the CO2 amine system, the CO2 is then dehydrated and compressed to about 2,500 psi, dense phase, and it's pipelined about 70 kilometers, call it 50 miles, to the Weyburn-Midale oil field, or it's sent about 3 kilometers or a couple miles away to the aquastore well. So what did we learn on Boundary Dam Unit 3? And again, we can spend a day and a half or more talking about what we learned on Boundary Dam Unit 3. We did that back in June down here in Bismarck. Craig had talked about scale up, and he talked about a 2 to 3 times scale up, and that's a pretty acceptable risk in terms of going forward with the carbon capture project. On Boundary Dam Unit 3, we had a 7,000 times scale up on the CO2 capture system. So people knew the amine process. It had been used in oil and gas for gas sweetening applications, but it hadn't been used on flue gas to any sort of scale. So SaskPower did a small pilot, and that pilot was successful, and it was actually scaled up 7,000 times to the full scale. So it was a major leap for SaskPower to do that sort of scale up. And that was a success. So the system does work with some challenges that I'll go through. Thermal integration, I mentioned it already a little bit, the 4 megawatts of additional generation that they're able to achieve. by using the waste heat is one example of thermal integration. The other example is they had the luxury of rebuilding that power plant at the same time they're putting the capture plant in. So the steam turbine was specially designed so that steam could be extracted between the IP and LP sections of the turbine, brought over to the capture plant, and it's a very efficient use of steam. There's not a lot of wastage there in terms of the thermal energy that gets robbed out of that power cycle. So that parasitic load was minimized. I mentioned the 4 megawatts electrical generation by cooling the flue gas. The cooler itself was a major risk item. The flue gas comes out very hot. It's got all of the acid gases in it, and they're all suspended. They haven't condensed out because it's hot enough to keep them suspended. Once you cool the flue gas down, those acids come out and they will attack steel quite aggressively. So some of those photos on there, you can see a failed flue gas cooler that the team went and saw as part of the risk mitigation exercise during the feed study. They ultimately selected a Teflon tubed flue gas cooler, and that's worked very well. It's not the best conductor of heat, but it stands up to the acid very well. Regulatory permitting was a success. So when SaskPower did this, nobody had done it before. Certainly hadn't done it in Saskatchewan. A lot of education was required, back to the education piece. And we had to really educate the regulator about what are the air emissions that will come out of this equipment, what are some of the waste streams that come out of this facility, and how do we permit them. And a lot of work was done there. Actually had to lean on some regulations that were in place over in Norway, brought them back to Canada, informed the regulator, and successfully got a permit for the project, and everything's been fine on that front. But don't underestimate the amount of work it is to get these projects permitted and approved. And then transition to operations. That's the last kind of major success from the SaskPower project. And as you can imagine, the SaskPower folks were really good at turning lignite coal into electricity. And the thought of running a chemical process was frightening. They didn't have any real knowledge of chemistry beyond water treatment. So a lot of work was done during the project to start a transition operations team. They brought operations into the project a couple of years before the plant started up, brought in some chemistry training, got in some standard operating procedures. They actually built a full simulator to use to train their operators, and that worked very well. They were very ready for the transition operations piece, and there were no issues on that side of things. But it came with a lot of work. On the challenges side of the equation, there were a lot, as you can imagine, first of a kind. And if we were to just pick one thing, it's probably fly ash. We affectionately refer to it as the F word. It causes a lot of issues with not just back pressure. Back pressure is the main issue. So it collects in this closed loop system of the amine. So the electrostatic precipitator pulls out 99.5% of the particulate that's in the flue gas, but that remaining 0.5%, it just gets in the system and it keeps circulating through. Attempts have been made to try to filter it out of the amine, and it works to a certain extent, but it's not perfect. So there's a lot of issues with fly ash sort of building up in equipment, building up in the absorber packing, and reducing how much flue gas can actually get pushed through the absorber tower. So that's the number one reason why, as I mentioned, in 9 years of operation, the facility hasn't captured 9 million tons of CO2, more like 5.5, 5.6 or 7. It's because of that back pressure issue. So a slipstream of the flue gas at Boundary Dam actually goes directly up the stack, and a portion goes through the capture plant. So the portion that goes through the capture plant, they're able to capture 90 to 95% of it. The design capture rate was 90%, so the system actually works quite well. It just doesn't have the ability to push all the flue gas through that equipment. In addition to that, amine degradation has been a challenge. Amine degradation was understood as a risk. There's some pre-treatment equipment in place, again, to remove things like sulfur, things like NO2. There were some other chemicals that have shown up. Iron is one of them. Even the fly ash itself was thought to be benign in terms of amine degradation, and it's actually caused some amine degradation reactions as well. So the rate of amine degradation is much higher than expected, and that's been a big issue for SaskPower as well. So kind of tied to that is flue gas characterization. And beyond fly ash, if you think of one thing that can be applied across essentially all industries that are looking at post-combustion carbon capture, is characterize your flue gas. Understand what's in your flue gas down to very detailed levels. Our flue gas is something that we all measure. We all generally know what's in it because we're satisfying the regulator in terms of what's in it, what's going out the stack. but it's different when it's an input now into your sophisticated chemistry process. You really need to understand what's in that flue gas, how much it varies over time, and what impact it'll have on your amine. It's very, very important to understand that. SaskPower thought they had their flue gas characterized, but the fly ash is a really good example of something that they didn't fully understand. And the chemical composition of these fine particulates of fly ash that get into the system are different than the bulk analysis that they did understand, and it's behaving differently than they expected. So reduced capacity. I talked a little bit already. Fouling is causing reduced capacity. We can't put all the flue gas through the system. The other thing that's really come up is recently, and it's been an issue for a little while, is the organic growth. So you can see the bottom right-hand side there, those photos. The first one is fly ash fouling, pretty obvious. It's fouling the system. It's hard to push all the flue gas through. But the organic growth is something that was really unexpected, and there's been a significant increase in the amount of organic growth in the absorber tower to the point where it's causing just as much, if not more, back pressure challenges than the fly ash. So this isn't something that's only a coal-fired power problem with fly ash. It's something that can affect essentially any industry. Anybody that has one of these absorber towers, if you get the right or the wrong sort of bug in the system, it can really like its environment. It can grow really well. And that's a big issue that SaskPower is grappling with today. So this is just an overview, and I'll go pretty quickly through this bit, but this is just a little bit more of what the Knowledge Center does to help clients across various industries, not just the power sector. We're finding that what we learn on Boundary Dam Unit 3 can be applied to essentially any industry that has a flue gas that they're considering post-combustion carbon capture, be it cement, mining, fertilizer, oil and gas, hydrogen production, steel production. They're quite applicable across a broad range of heavy emitting industries. And some of the key things really to consider, I've talked about all these things, but it's really flue gas characterization. If you remember one thing that I say about what we learned at Boundary Dam Unit 3, beyond fly ash, it's characterize your flue gas. Characterize your flue gas. Understand what it is that's going into this new process you're considering bringing online. So some of the things that my team does, I mentioned we did a technical workshop for the Lignite Energy Council back in June. That's one of my favorite things that we do. They're kind of exhausting. They're 1 or 2 days of sitting down, going through, again, the 450 slides, but it's fascinating, the conversations that come up, and people typically go away with some questions that they didn't know they had. They're thinking about some unknown unknowns that they hadn't really considered yet. So it's quite gratifying for my team to go through that with people and understand help people understand what they hadn't thought about yet. I talked about flue gas characterization. I won't talk any more about that. Kind of the next step for flue gas characterization is to actually do a pilot scale test. So people will actually bring a little pilot skid, test their actual flue gas with the actual amine, and see what happens. And SaskPower did this. It was partially a success. They were testing to see whether the process worked or not. 7,001 scale up. They didn't know if it was going to work, and they found out that it worked. They got a feel for what the regeneration energy was that was going to be required to regenerate the amine. What they didn't think about was the long-term effect of the amine and the flue gas interacting and what sort of degradation reactions would happen. They only did about a 9-week test, and it should have been a lot longer than that. So that's something we give people advice on that are doing pilot tests, ideally before they do the pilot test, just around the program and how to go about it. And then we help people with technology selection and what type of technology is right, and then even screening the providers as they get into it. So I won't belabor that. So this last piece, so the team that I lead at the Knowledge Center is really the bunch of nerdy engineers and chemists that get into the details, as I've just talked about. We also have another team that deals more with strategic considerations, policy interpretation. We have consulted with the Canadian government about their rules. There was some consultation around 45Q that our team did before it was put in place as well. And that group is also really looking at the public education side of things too. We see ourselves as a really good sort of agnostic third-party expert that can come in and talk about the safety and security and the fact we've actually done it. We've done it and we've shown that it works. We think there's a role for us to play there in terms of that education side of things. So thank you for your time, and with that, I'll close off and open it up to any questions.
Conway, in the United States, we got the carrot versus the stick.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about what you guys are doing up there on the carbon tax side of it?
Sure.
And I think it will shed some light to those that are wondering why we're in pursuit of this to make sure we're on the right side of the ledger in the future. So just your carbon tax is one that just it needs to be talked about, please.
Sure, Stacy. Yeah, so we have carrots and we have sticks, and our carrot isn't as attractive as your carrot. So we have an investment tax credit that if you do a CCS project, you get 50% of your capital costs back for every dollar you spend before the end of 2030. If you're after 2030, then you only get 25% of your money back in terms of a tax credit. So it's good, but there's no certainty to it. It's not nearly as certain as what you have with 45Q with a production tax credit, where you know you're getting a hard dollar for every ton of CO2 that you sequester. We like our sticks in Canada, so we do have a carbon tax in Canada. It started out at $50 a ton in 2022, and it's going to escalate up to $170 a ton by 2030. So at present, it's $65 a ton that utilities pay, all industry pays above a certain level for emissions. I'll back up. So every sector of industry has a baseline allowable emission level, and anything that you emit above that baseline allowable attracts the carbon tax. So the carbon tax right now is $65 a ton Canadian. It's going to go up by $15 every year until it reaches $170 by 2030. And at the same time, those baseline allowable levels are going down. So there's kind of an exponential impact there in terms of the economic impact to industry, essentially. So that money gets collected by the federal government. It goes into technology funds. They're still trying to figure out how to actually put that money back into industry to help support them in cleaning up their emissions and helping to keep them competitive. So there's a lot of conversation in Canada right now about regulatory certainty, or the massive lack thereof. So we're honestly looking down south of the border quite jealously towards you guys with the production tax credit and a lot more clarity, notwithstanding the issues you have with EPA. But I'm hearing in this room today that you're quite confident that will go away, and I've heard that from other people in the electricity sector in the U.S. as well. So, but that's the Canadian picture. It's a little bit bleak, and as I said, the concept of coal-fired power generation, coal is kind of a four-letter word in Canada, and I'm not very optimistic about the future of coal-fired power in Canada.
Is this open? Oh. Yeah, thanks. I guess I think towards the tail end there, you probably got to the heart of my question, which was really just thoughts about the general future of the unit in Canada and all those kind of things. But maybe I'll twist it up a little bit. And is there anybody talking about perhaps taking the CO2 off the unit and send it the other direction down the Weyburn pipeline and do an EOR here? It sounds like we could use CO2.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know how seriously that's been considered. And certainly if you can, so that's the other piece I missed, actually. Thank you for bringing that up. The Canadian investment tax credit that I mentioned, you get 50% of your capital back if you're done your project by 2030. It excludes EOR. So any project that wants to use CO2 for enhanced oil recovery in Canada doesn't get that tax credit. So the small carrot that's available, it gets taken away. So certainly the potential of capturing CO2 and sending it south of the border, it raises a lot of issues just around liability and crossing borders. Although we have crossed that bridge previously with Dakota Gas sending CO2 up to Canada for the last 20 plus years, knowing that that's going to change. But I could certainly see it being attractive for people in Canada that want to do a CCS project. I think they would lose the Canadian carrot, but it might be more attractive to go after the American carrot, if you know what I mean.
Once Canada's successful at doing all this, what kind of industry are they going to have left?
Sorry, what kind of industry do they have left?
Yeah, $170 per metric ton. Sounds to me like you're just going to pay people to stay home and do nothing.
Yeah, you're not far off. You're not far off there, and so right now the government in power in Canada is very left-leaning. That's who brought in the carbon tax. One of the challenges the companies have is they can't actually even finance a project based on the carbon tax because it's not enshrined in legislation in any way. So that carbon tax could go away. There's an election coming up in Canada in 2 years, and the right side party, his soundbite right now is axe the tax. So it's really going to be interesting to see what happens if there is an election, or if there's a change in government in the next election as to what happens with the carbon tax. But that just adds another layer of uncertainty in Canada around making these projects actually happen, allowing industry to actually keep operating by doing these carbon capture projects, is the uncertainty around the carbon tax, and will it still be there? But it's a big challenge for us.
Conway, I wanted to take and follow up on the questions from Stacy and Mike Hager. You had on the slide by 2030, no unabated coal.
Yeah.
So if you added a boundary dam replica to Shand or Poplar River, what's the level that's defined as abated? Is it 95% or what?
So it was an easier answer previously, Mike, and the answer used to be cleaner than natural gas. So it used to be down to an emissions intensity of 380 tons per gigawatt hour. The clean electricity regulation that Canada is proposing and is under consultation right now, we're just going through it and trying to understand. But as best we can tell, they're lumping natural gas generation and coal-fired generation together, and they're talking about an emissions intensity level of 30 tons per gigawatt hour, which in theory is achievable for natural gas, where you're starting out at about 400 or 380, but that requires about 92.5%, 95% capture, call it, to get there. On coal-fired power, that's going to be 98, 99% capture level, which is just impractical. So it used to be an easy answer. It's a much more complicated answer now. We don't know what it actually means even for Boundary Dam Unit 3, Mike.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to give my next one. When we were up touring their facility, we saw they have a virtual reality for operators. So my question is, that thing at all mobile? Can you bring it down here to train operators, or it's not that far? Is that have utility in training the next generation of operators for the next facility?
So that simulator is specific to the SaskPower plant, and it goes through the SO2 system, which other people won't have, and it goes through the CO2 system. But we do highly recommend people consider simulators, and it's actually something that the Knowledge Center is considering is, should we build our own simulator, make it customizable, and offer that as a service for people when they get through that purple zone of feasibility and feed studies into the red zone of execution, start thinking about transition operations. It's expensive to build and own your own simulator, and there's likely a market for somebody to have a customizable simulator that people can come in and train on a simulator system to get ready to operate their own project.
How integrated are the grids between your provinces? What will your fossil fuel dependent provinces do if their coal-fired plants are shut down? So
the provinces are intertied, and we're intertied with the United States as well. Manitoba's the province directly to the east of Saskatchewan, and they're largely a hydro-based grid. So that's a really good source of net zero electricity for Saskatchewan, but it's limited in terms of how much we can get across. And there certainly there aren't thousands of megawatts of intertie to allow that to happen, to allow the clean electrons to flow from east to west. That's not really an option. It's a big challenge for the western provinces, particularly Saskatchewan and Alberta, and the politicians are actually arm wrestling about that right now. So it's not going very well in terms of planning for this clean electricity regulation. A lot of conversation yet to be had. And in terms of actually achieving net zero by 2035, there'll have to be CCS on every natural gas-fired generator in both Alberta and Saskatchewan, And to tie on some of Craig's comments earlier about just supply chain and labor availability to actually execute those projects, it's actually impractical to consider doing that many CCS projects. Even though we're blessed, as North Dakota is, blessed with really good pore space, the ability to store CO2 is, as cheap as it can be kind of anywhere in the world. Just getting people to build those projects is going to be a big challenge. So I think it's going to be, I just can't see it carrying on as written today. I don't think Saskatchewan and Alberta can physically comply with that rule.